This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, there's just one word, war. We're at war right now. Russia is at war with Ukraine, and Ukraine is under attack. And according to everything that we're reading about and getting updates on, Ukraine is basically being occupied. And I'm using that word deliberately because we're going to give an analysis of that. There are talks today between a Ukrainian and Russian delegation in Belarus today, basically resulted in nothing and fell apart. Hundreds of Ukrainians, both military and civilians, have been killed. Russian soldiers have been killed. Russian envoys have been taken out. Vladimir Putin and his economy has suffered tremendously. The ruble is down over 30%. The Russian stock exchange stopped trading today. Russia is buying gold. The airspace over Russia is basically shut down from Europe, United States, and other countries. Basically, Russia's getting hammered economically. The sanctions are kind of taking hold and really having an impact. Vladimir Putin appears to be a little bit backed into a corner, Jamal, because he has initiated high-level nuclear armaments and capabilities within his nuclear capability and is on full alert for potential nuclear attack, which is really kind of incredible that we're talking about this in 2022. And with all of that, Jamal, the coverage of the war in Ukraine has been outrageous. It's been full of misinformation, full of racism, and we're going to be covering all of that today.
You're absolutely right, Jess, and that's the key word. It has been racist, and stay tuned because we're going to talk about and we're going to basically demonstrate all the different racist statements and sentiments and the difference between the coverage of this war and the war on Iraq and the war on Palestine and the war on Lebanon. And I just have to say, you got to have blonde hair and blue eyes to get this kind of coverage. But first, Jess, we have a very good interview with Javier Davila, a social justice educator and equity program advisor with the Toronto District School Board, who came under relentless attack by pro-Israel groups, in particular B'nai B'rith, also including the media in his hometown, the Toronto Sun tabloid, which basically attacked him for basically sharing information, just basically sharing information about the occupation, about Palestine. This is, again, it's almost connected to what's happening with the Ukraine, and he was smeared, and he was harassed, and he was attacked, and he was put on leave. Of course, he has been reinstated afterwards, and now he's filed a lawsuit. So let's watch Javier. We have discussed academic freedom and the silencing of critics of Israel on college campuses many times on this show. This has been a common theme. Our guest today, Javier Davila, a social justice educator and equity program advisor with the Toronto District School Board. Mr. Davila was put on home assignment and under investigation in Ontario after sharing information on Palestinian rights, including a resource guide that explains the difference between criticism of Israel and its state ideology, Zionism on the one hand, and anti-Jewish bigotry on the other. Subsequently, Mr. Davila was smeared in 3 separate columns in the right-wing Toronto Sun tabloid and by B'nai B'rith Canada, a leading anti-Palestinian lobby group. Davila was ultimately reinstated last July and did not face any former discipline. On July 10th, Davila and his attorneys Dimitri Laskaris and Stephen Ellis announced that they had filed a lawsuit against B'nai B'rith and its chief executive Michael Moston under the country's Libel and Slander Act. Welcome to Arab Talk, Javier.
Thank you so much, Jamal. Really happy to be here today.
I don't know if I've summarized this well. I mean, I know it's a long ordeal, but let's start first by telling us about your role as an educator, as a student equity program advisor.
Sure. Again, thank you so much for having me here. To set a little bit of context, I work in Toronto. I've been an educator for 16 years at the Toronto District School Board. For folks that don't know, it's the largest school board in Canada. It has about 600 schools, 250,000 educators, and 40,000 staff. And my primary role as student equity program advisor is really to bring anti-oppression, decolonial, and anti-racist resources to educators, to staff, and to students. And what that really looks like for me, often alongside with and centering the voices of marginalized youth, those whose voices and identities have been erased. So, for example, Black students, for example, Indigenous students, Muslim students, queer and trans students, and disabled students, and using their voices to create programming and educational supports in the school board to sort of set direction, whether it be policy, resources, or education. That's kind of in a nutshell what I do. I know
I mean, it sounds very rewarding, really. I mean, trying to bring voice to the, the marginalized communities and educate people about each other, really. I mean, this is a common theme. And now here you find yourself in the middle of a smear campaign. Did this really surprise you? And, when you learn about your suspension and all these attacks?
So I've been involved in a number of different anti-oppression organizations. I was organized one of the first LGBTQ conferences in Canada for students and educators. I was co-authored the first guidelines and policies for trans and gender non-conforming students. I co-facilitated a workshop on educators on dismantling white supremacy. And all of these things had a lot of support and were celebrated. Of course, there was some backlash. But when it comes to Palestine solidarity, there's consistently been silencing and pressure. So I've actually been suspended and investigated 3 times in my career over 16 years for Palestine solidarity. Once just for having a sticker that supported boycott, divestment, sanctions. One for calling out the suspension of a Black student who said "Free Palestine" over the PA. And then this most recent example, which I guess I'll get into in a few moments.
Let's go to the positive things first. You received, from what I researched and read, broad support. You received support from your colleagues, from educators, unions, the parents of your students. I mean, didn't this make you feel, good that at least you weren't left alone to suffer?
It was absolutely amazing, the outpouring for support. So for folks that don't know, in my job as a gender-based violence prevention or student equity program advisor, one of the things I did was create an opt-in mail-out. And this opt-in mail-out was for educators to receive resources on anti-racism, intersectional decolonial frameworks that specifically call out anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And over the years, it's been 12 years since I've been operating this opt-in mail-out where I curate resources. I haven't received a single negative comment. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Educators and even directors of other school boards have asked to receive these resources. And so it's May 2021. For folks that remember the context, we have major forces or protests impending, forced evictions and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. We have Israel violently raiding Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, Israeli airstrikes bombarding the Gaza strips. We have Palestinian students in our schools who are impacted by these very things. And so in the same way I've always been responsive to current world events and to the needs of students and educators who have a lack of resources on this subject, I provided 2 opt-in mailouts, and that's where the controversy began. But like you said, there was so much broad support. The day after I sent out the 2 opt-in mailout resources, I received dozens of emails from Jewish educators within the school system thanking me for actually approaching the subject in very nuanced and careful ways. Community members created a public petition in support, amassing 5,000 signatures. International or national unions, Canadian unions of postal workers, Canadian unions of public employees, the Canadian Federation of Students, a group of 30 administrators, anonymous, of course, for fear of reprisal, wrote a letter, grassroots groups of educators organized writing campaigns, even Jewish family members and who have students in the school publicly came out in support and published a petition that said the resources that Mr. Davila shared were in no way anti-Semitic. A group of 80 concerned educators identified only by their initials and the names of their schools also wrote letters of support. Former students from Forest Hill, the Washington Post and the Toronto Star wrote opinion pieces in support. And communities came together and even started a GoFundMe for legal fees to counteract the attacks I was facing, which I guess we'll get into.
I mean, did you think that this support played a key role in your reinstatement? You were reinstated without discipline.
I was subject to 2 extensive investigations. So one by the Human Rights Office of the school board and one by Employee Services. And they cleared me. But that reinstatement only came out after this outpouring of tremendous support. And what we really saw in this tremendous support was the stories, particularly of Palestinian students saying they can't even identify as Palestinian in the school board, or Palestinian students saying in one school, students were openly wearing T-shirts of the Israeli Defense Forces or Israeli occupation forces, but they were not allowed to wear a keffiyeh. We saw educators talking about the silence and surveillance of their media. And so it was the first time that I've seen this public outpouring of support, not only for me, but against anti-Palestinian racism in school boards. And I think this was evidence of a shifting culture and a shifting discourse on Palestine that we could no longer ignore, and certainly the school board could no longer ignore. And yes, I was reinstated without discipline.
So nevertheless, the smearing has continued. How dangerous is this to academic freedom at educational institutions throughout Canada?
So to give an idea of the smearing, so not only did you mentioned the 3 columns written by a right-wing columnist known for Islamophobic content and who is also even censured by the Journalist Integrity Writers Guild for inaccurate reporting, and the school board listened to her as the complaint. But the attacks from B'nai B'rith have been relentless, coordinated, malicious, and designed to maximize harm. After my reinstatement, they continued to make false statements against me. They made an additional complaint with my professional body, the Ontario College of Teachers, having them wanting to revoke my teaching license. And they even made a complaint with the Toronto Police, accusing me of incitement to hatred and incitement to genocide. Wow. This is absolutely the most horrible thing I've ever been through, not only attacking my reputation and career prospects, but making me the target of harassment and hate, and really attacking my sense of dignity. I really pride myself on knowing that our liberations are inextricably linked and that we are interdependent, and that anti-oppression means I have a responsibility and accountability to center the voices of Palestinians. But the attacks have been relentless. But I'm not the first and I'm not the last. I think we saw this most recently, perhaps you're aware, at the University of Toronto, right, where the law, or Azarova was her name, international human rights expert, was offered a job, and the job was rescinded after a pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian lobby group learned that she was offered the position, and had one of their former board members, who happened to be a judge, contact the University of Toronto and say that there would be public outcry if she was hired. It turns out in the past, many years ago, she wrote 2 pieces that were critical of Israeli state policy using an international law framework. We've had other teachers, Nadia Shufani a couple of years ago here in Toronto,
Right.
who other smear campaigns, and you mentioned Shahad Abu Salam in the UK, who was also attacked by anti-Palestinian lobby groups. So the threat to academic freedom is real. The culture of fear is real. And even the threat of losing your job, of being subject to harassment and hate, and in my case, the threat of arrest has become very real. So the threat to academic freedom and how employers and schools and universities are complicit in these attacks is something that I'm really focused on, and really seeing so much support building around.
Look, as an immigrant or the brown, black, a minority, one would tend to kind of develop a little bit of a thicker skin, facing harassment, facing discrimination. But these attacks and these smears must have affected you psychologically. I mean, how do you cope with this?
Yes. So I grew up actually in a high control religious sect, and I was shunned by my community and my religious community when I came out as queer. And I was told that this shunning was an act of love, and that any suffering I experienced was my fault. So I'm very familiar with gaslighting. Palestinians have been told the violence against them does not exist or is their fault. They have been consistently gaslit. And this takes such an emotional toll, even when we know it's not our fault. The internalized shame, the trauma, the anticipation of violence is a daily struggle that has continued to harm me. And often standing up for justice requires a risk. It means that we make ourselves vulnerable. And this vulnerability is used against us. So it's caused me and continues to cause me great trauma and harm. At the same time, this vulnerability has also been a gift. It has allowed me to nourish and forge relationships built on solidarity and built on love. And I'm not saying this in some sort of, fuzzy unicorn imaginary sort of way, but these relationships save lives. And it is by standing together in solidarity that we can name injustice, that together that we can resist, together that we can change conditions, and together that we can build new worlds centered in transformative justice. And nobody is free until Palestinians have self-determination, and they are free. So despite the harm, I will continue to fight.
Well said. Listen, I know that this is a pending lawsuit against the Israel Lobby Group, so you don't have to get into the weeds, but what remedies are you seeking?
Really, I would like for them to admit that they were wrong and to apologize and to retract their statements. And if we win, I imagine the courts will decide on damages. I would really like to see them to stop attacking educators, to stop attacking students who support Palestinians, and redirect their resources and energies to supporting true liberation, to actually addressing real anti-Semitism that is rooted in white supremacy, the same way Islamophobia is, the same way imperialism and colonialism. That's not going to happen. That's not their purpose. So perhaps at the very least, we can shine a light on how racist these organizations are, how illegitimate they are, and stop listening to them, and set a real precedent so that educators can stand in solidarity with Palestine without fear of violence, without fear of attacks. And so that it comes at a great cost to pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian lobby groups. And really, I'd like to send a message to school boards, universities, and unions that they have a responsibility to protect their educators and students by standing up to bullies and anti-Palestinian lobby groups like B'nai B'rith. We talk a lot about bullying, and we even create bullying prevention plans in schools and create intervention strategies for students. What message are we sending students when school boards give in to the bullying or universities give in to the bullying of organizations like B'nai B'rith?
Javier Davila, thank you for sharing your story on Arab Talk.
I'm so grateful to be here. I do want to mention that we are raising funds to support this legal challenge to B'nai B'rith, which will be a long and difficult one. It's on GoFundMe. It's available in the Electronic Intifada article or on my Twitter, XJustice, XPeace. Or, of course, you can Google me, Javier, Javier, Davila, Davila, and GoFundMe. And we really appreciate collective resources to support this collective fight for Palestinian liberation.
Thank you, Javier, and good luck.
Thank you, Jamal.
That's the voice and the face of Javier Davila, social justice educator and coordinator for the Toronto School District in Toronto. Vicious attack. Now, let's be clear, Jamal. He wasn't proposing or advocating any political beliefs. He was just sharing information. And because of sharing information about Palestine, he was relieved of his position, put on home duty, reinstated, but to his credit, he's suing after this vicious attack by B'nai B'rith, by his local newspaper, and again, kind of the racist asymmetry of how certain people can talk about being occupied and get away with it, but if you talk about Palestinians or Syrians,
you can't use the word occupation. You cannot use the word apartheid.
You can't talk about how Palestinians or Syrians or anybody, Iraqis, Yemenis, you can't dare talk about how they may defend themselves against a brutal occupation. But if you happen to be blonde and blue-eyed and you are doing exactly the same thing, being occupied and defending yourself, then it's okay. You get a pass. So your interview with Javier was really quite excellent, Jamal, and it serves as a reminder and as a foundation, if you will, of what we're going to transition to here in a minute with the outrageous coverage by the Western media of the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, and the double standard. Let me begin by saying something, and this is I'm sharing my sentiments and your sentiments as well. Just being Palestinian, who basically my family was made refugees in 1948 and suffered under Israeli brutal occupation. We are against any sort of occupation, period. I mean, this is the whole idea, Russia occupying the Ukraine or having foreign forces in Syria or Libya or Iraq and so on. Just it goes against our beliefs and
right.
what
100%.
our own experience. I don't want to kind of like get people confused, but the coverage of what's happening, you know,
and the interpretation,
with the invasion and the interpretation with the war on and the juxtaposition. I mean, it has been shameful, and I'm trying to hold my anger. I'm telling you, this past few days, I wanted to break my TV screen several times. I mean, the racial bias in Western media coverage. I don't know how these so-called reporters can say that they are journalists. And I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about French TV, UK TV, American TV, you name it. And we're going to go by some examples. And I'm sure some people maybe watch these and didn't pay attention to those.
But we did.
But we did. And then it's like What is it? Is it because Ukrainians are white and their proximity to West or whatever that it is,
Well, look at this, Jamal.
you have to
Look at
you
this.
have to kind of have this different coverage when it came to a European white country being under attack versus brown people, black people. I mean, let's be very clear.
Let's be very clear about that. And I just want to reiterate what you've said, and our listeners and viewers need to understand that. We are categorically against the occupation of any country, of any land like this. And we are, Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves against occupation in this brutal invasion. But guess what? So do people all over the world, irrespective of their color, their creed, their faith, their religion, whatever it is. And that's really what we're going to speak about today, Jamal. We're going to point out the racist, Islamophobic, basically anti-Arab, anti-brown, anti-black sentiment, the flatly racist sentiment, on how it's okay for Ukrainians to defend their sovereignty, but not okay for Palestinians, not okay for Iraqis, not okay for Syrians, not okay for Yemenis, not okay for, swaths of the African continent to defend themselves from a colonial occupation. So let's be clear. Ukraine has every right to defend themselves, but let's be real. When you hear about how it's articulated and how this is somehow these Ukrainians, it's okay for them to defend themselves.
I'll start by our own CBS News, and then we'll go down the line. And this is Charlie D'Agata, who, by the way, apologized on Sunday. So I have to say she apologized after she was criticized and after claiming on air that the attacks on Ukraine cannot be compared to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because, the European country is more civilized. And here I'm quoting from what she said. This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, and I have to choose those words carefully to city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. I mean, I don't know what thoughts go behind these statements. Even though during when he was saying that during that, Charlie, he kind of like said, I have to, watch my words, choose my words, but he didn't. He's like using the word civilized. I mean, here you have someone who's supposedly a journalist, educated, and he's making a distinction and making a judgment about who is civilized and who's uncivilized. So I guess I am uncivilized because
I guess I'm uncivilized too. But I want to point out another error that Charlie D'Agata made, Jamal, and he said, well, in Iraq and in the Arab world, it's been going on for many years and many decades. Breaking news, Charlie. Ukraine has been under attack from Russia from before Crimea in 2015, even before that. So it's been a decade or so or more that the Ukrainians have been fighting off this onslaught by Russia to reoccupy and retake over and try to destabilize that country. So not only is he racist and inaccurate in what he said, he completely misrepresented this kind of picture of what's happening in Ukraine, like this happened all of a sudden. It's simply not true.
Well, I started with this because I'm sure a lot of people watch this report and they have CBS, but I'll bring up some other coverage.
But what was his apology, Jamal? What was his apology? It was kind of half-hearted,
using the word civilized. Basically, he later, he apologized because he came under attack. I mean, I'm sure his editors, etc., they went after him. But I'm gonna move on because some of these things are not from the U.S. and here is from France. Right? This is BFM TV. This is one of the largest broadcasters in France, and I'm quoting. We are in the 21st century. We are in a European city, and we have cruise missiles fired as though we were in Iraq or Afghanistan. Can you imagine? So he's surprised. The commentator is surprised, leading the news, saying that during, this is during a live broadcast. And then when from another broadcast on also BFM TV, journalist Philippe Corb said, We're not talking here about Syrians fleeing the bombing of the Syrian regime backed by Putin. We're talking about Europeans living in cars that look like ours to save their lives.
Well, I guess only European people driving BMWs are allowed to get justified to save their lives, Jamal. Not, with the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of refugees within Yemen, again, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, we don't have the BMWs, I guess, that we can drive up to a border and try to get out. So it's uncivilized to save our children. It's uncivilized to save our lives and to save our families. Somehow, because we're not blonde and blue-eyed, we don't have, you have to be blonde, blue-eyed and have a BMW. Because I did see that picture of that one crossing into Poland where a family pulled up in a very nice, brand new BMW, and they were kind of ushered into Poland without any problem. And I went back, Jamal, and thought about all of the Syrian refugees trying to get into Moldova, trying to get into Poland, trying to get into these countries after they were being slaughtered and trying to save their lives and being denied entry, fences being built so that they couldn't get in.
Well, actually, talking about this, and we can talk about it if we have more time, but also a lot of immigrants who are in the Ukraine, brown people, black people, people from African countries, Middle East, etc., they have been refused entry into Poland.
They can't leave.
They cannot leave the
Jamal,
country.
they can't leave
because of the color of their skin. So it gets crazier, Jess. And this is I'm faulting, and this one is from BBC. I'm faulting the interviewer, not for what he said, but for what he did not do. He did not intercede. So here you have Ukraine's deputy chief prosecutor, David Sakvardisi, told BBC, he was on the air, and I'm sure people saw that if you watch BBC. It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. And then you have the BBC presenter, Ross Atkins, basically allowing him and kind of agreeing with him.
Not calling him out.
Not calling him out. Continue talking about, I feel you, I hear you, blah, blah, blah. That kind of thing. Later on, of course, again, because of the tweets, because I tweeted about this and tens of other people also tweeted about it, is basically now Ross Atkins apologized just today for failing to challenge the prosecutor about his remarks. I mean, again, this is a failure on a global network.
It's a global
BBC
failure.
To allow such talk to somebody talking about lamenting, people, the people who are coming under attack have blue eyes and blonde hair. In other words, brown people and black people, it's okay that they should become refugees and they should get slaughtered in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Africa, and everywhere else.
But that's precisely the message, Jamal, and that's precisely what this portrayal of the occupation of Ukraine is all about. I mean, you're talking about the extreme examples, which I'm glad that we're putting out there. But there are more subtle examples, that you and I both see, applauding the heroism of the Ukrainian people.
I haven't even gotten to the subtle. I mean, I think you and I cannot count the subtle. I really,
it's
really,
beyond
you need
we can't. I've lost track.
Yeah, you cannot really count. It's like it's on a daily basis, both in print, on radio, on TV. Here's another outrageous thing. This is again, I'm bringing it back home to NBC News correspondent Haley Kobiela, who said,
"Oh yeah, I
to
saw
put
this.
it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from Ukraine. They are Christians. They are white. They are very similar to us." She didn't. They are very similar, but I'm finishing her sentence. NBC News, CBS News, BBC.
And she didn't apologize. And she didn't apologize yet.
I didn't hear. I didn't. Maybe she apologized later on. I didn't. I didn't hear it. And here is a surprise for you from Al Jazeera English, which I thought they'll do a better coverage. Having been with Al Jazeera. So even Al Jazeera English was forced to apologize, and they did apologize after presenter Peter Dobby said during this past Sunday broadcast, and I'm quoting, "What's compelling is looking at them, the way they are dressed. These are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from the Middle East or North Africa. They look like any European family that you'd live next door to."
And that's Al Jazeera.
This is
That's
Al
Al
Jazeera
Jazeera.
English.
Okay, Al Jazeera English. So if that level of Islamophobia, racism, anti-Arab, anti-Black bias is allowed to pervade even Al Jazeera English, Jamal, the BBC, NBC, CBS. And here's the thing, besides you and I who have our show on Arab Talk calling everybody out, I haven't heard a peep from the mainstream media or even the not so subtle mainstream media calling out this BS, calling out this racism, allowing this kind of disrespectful and racist reporting to continue. It's really outrageous that
this is the tip of the iceberg. And remember, since the very first racist statement was issued, I don't know if it was first CBS or I lost count which one, and then many journalists started tweeting and writing about it. They continued on repeating this, and I said we don't have. We lost count on the soft kind of racism and lost track of the print. I'll give you an example of the print, but I'm sure if you search the print, this is from the English Telegraph, and this is by Daniel Hannan, and he wrote, "They seem so like us. That's it. That is what makes it so shocking. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations. It can happen to anyone." I mean, like this is soft, I would say, racist, but again, this kind of disbelief. What are you talking about? War does not happen. Hello, World War I, World War II, where were they? On Mars? I mean, the most atrocious wars in history happened in Europe.
Hello. And let's not forget the atrocities that were committed in Vietnam, Jamal. Let's not forget about the atrocities that have been committed in Algeria. We're talking about things that historically happened in the 60s and in the early 70s, and then bringing it all the way up to the first Gulf War, into the second Gulf War, into the war in Afghanistan. Just bringing it into what's happening right now, Jamal. And the lack of historical perspective is one thing. But again, the blatant Islamophobia and racism and inability to fathom the fact that war is war, and irrespective of your skin color, your eye color, and your faith, war is devastating. And breaking news to all these journalists, middle-class people have died in all of the wars that I spoke about. Middle-class people died in Algeria, died in Vietnam, died in Iraq. Middle-class people died in Syria, died in Palestine, died and are dying in Yemen. So this BS like, oh my God, the middle class are dying now, that kind of statement is so blatantly disturbing. I mean, again, I'm not sure. I mean, you call it kind of soft. To me, when I hear those kinds of comments, my outrage in some ways is even greater because it's such a profound level of ignorance, Jamal, that level of ignorance. And again, journalists, mainstream media, you fact-checked by their editors, allegedly can get away with saying this kind of BS.
Just this takes me back to the war on Iraq, because I covered the war on Iraq. I've been into Iraq not once, twice. And I've covered the war on Iraq when I was producing Mosaic, so we kept track of everything that was said, what was happening on several Middle Eastern TV stations, and as well as American broadcasts. And if you recall, many people, I mean, we knew that the coverage was imperfect. For one thing, most American media outlets, remember, they used to put this bug. Fluttering flag, they went into nationalism, which you're not supposed to do that. I mean, you're a journalist, you're supposed to report on what's going on. And then they took their nationalistic behavior, and every single news network was flying these flags and showing patriotism and nationalism. So it's kind of like a reminder, but this is kind of, it took a whole different direction. because now you have Western media outlets also at the same time, aside from their racism, they have been glorifying Ukrainian resistance, right? So they're talking about,
Absolutely.
so you see this, they're glorifying Ukrainian, and again, we're not taking side. I think it's wrong. In the invasion on Ukraine is wrong, and countries have the right to resist, to defend their land. But, immediately they're glorifying that, right? They would never do that for black and brown countries. They would never.
No. No.
Even they're talking about crowdfunding campaigns towards efforts, on social media and other things, donation, money accounts, PayPal, everything they've been talking about. They will never talk about this when it comes. Like, think about it. They're showing how, and I'm sure millions of people have watched this report, how Ukrainian residents or residents of Kiev have been filling bottles to make Molotov
Right.
bombs and hand them to the resistance. If they showed Palestinians and glorified the way that they are filling whatever Molotov cocktail bombs, do you think they'll get away with this?
No, Jamal, and that's the perfect example. And the fact that somehow the resistance that Palestinians, that Iraqis, that Afghans, that Yemenis, that Africans, when they attempt to resist brutal colonial occupation and war, they're called, when we might as well, what are they called, Jamal? They're called terrorists.
Terrorists. As I said,
Yeah.
if you show a Palestinian with a Molotov cocktail bomb, every single media outlet here will call him or her a terrorist. They will not call them
Jamal,
a resistance fighter, even though Palestine has been under occupation for 70 plus years.
Even if they throw rocks, Jamal, children throwing rocks defending their homelands are called terrorists. I wanna like get your opinion about something else, because not only is the reporting of the resistance in Ukraine deeply racist and biased and totally kind of Islamophobic. I mean, it's unacceptable. People have also lost sight of the narrative that Putin has used in his reasoning for occupying Ukraine. He's using the Israeli narrative, Jamal. He's saying, oh, well, Russia has to defend itself against the brutal ethnic cleansing that is taking place. Russia must defend itself. And what does Putin call Ukraine, Jamal? Disputed.
I was waiting for you to say that. Then the other point is it hasn't it didn't exist.
Never
as a country.
existed.
It wasn't never exist.
Right.
So basically, people don't
Putin
have the right for self-determination, and that's
right. So
that's basically
the
Israeli argument and the Zionist argument right here in the United States for
That's
Palestinians
exactly right.
to remain enslaved and under
nobody said
occupation
anything.
indefinitely.
But no one has said anything about the Putin narrative about that. Nobody. He's taking the apartheid Israeli narrative for how to occupy and enslave and basically ethnic cleanse a people and using it as a justification for invading Ukraine. And no one's making that connection whatsoever, let alone the other connections that the Americans and the Allied forces used when they invaded Afghanistan, when they invaded Iraq, and all. I mean, it's mind-boggling, Jamal. It makes your head and my head spin. We want to throw things at our TV. We don't do it, but we are obligated. We have a moral obligation to call out this racism, this Islamophobic, this anti-black, anti-brown, anti-Arab, anti-African kind of. It's beyond bias. I mean, it's racism and nothing else. And the idea that blue-eyed and blonde people are suffering somehow more than brown and black people is absolutely abhorrent, and we need to call it out.
Do you know what I call it, Jess? I call it a blend of racism and Orientalism at the same time. This is why probably these reporters should read Edward Said's book,
Said.
just to
And
learn
on the
about this.
intro.
Is because you know what? When they speak this way, when they write this way, they're not even. I mean, I'm not a judge of character. I'm not going to say this particular person is a racist or not. I think some of them are, just like in any society you have racists and you know, but others, they just like process their thoughts. They don't even think twice about their words. It's just like this is how the way they see things, that you know.
But Jamal,
they can only show their emotions if the victim is white. It's the same story, and actually, I have to give it a credit to my wife, who reminded me of this. It's the same story, and sadly, I have to say, when a white woman disappears in the United States. So when a white woman disappears, and you remember the last case and other cases, it's all over. It's like, you know, wall-to-wall coverage about this. And then you have hundreds of African American women and other brown women who get murdered, disappear, etc., kidnapped. You don't hear their stories.
well, that's exactly right, Jamal. That's a great point, and I think we need to drive it home. And so I know that we're commenting on the actual reporters, but I want to go back to, because we only have a minute or so left. What's going on with the editors, Jamal? None of this stuff gets on the air without editorial oversight, whether it's in print or video or audio. So the complicity is not just an individual reporter. The complicity here, Jamal, and this is important, is systematic and systemic. It's a systemic racism. It's a systemic bias that includes not just reporters, but editors and entire news organizations. And this is something that we're going to continue to cover because, you know, just before we wrap up, you know, this situation in Ukraine and Belarus may get involved right now.
They are getting involved.
Yeah, this is going to get much worse. And so we're going to pay attention to the realities of the occupation and the war. And we're going to pay attention to the way in which it's covered, because both things are going to be active stories for us on Arab Talk for the foreseeable future.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest episodes. And we will talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.